Tēnā koutou te whanau o Unitarians o Tamaki Makaurau. Tēnā koutou nā Manuhiri. No mai haere mai, me ki tēnei whare karakia te atua. Ko Ted Zorn toko ingoa, ko Charleston, South Carolina, USA, aho. Ko Cooper River te awa, ko Pinnacle Mountain te maunga. Ke Tamaki Makaurau, aho e noro ana. He waka e ke noa. No reira e ro rangatira ma, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you. Welcome all to this place of worship and fellowship, made sacred by Auckland Unitarians for over 120 years. Welcome also to those joining us remotely or watching the recording at a later time. If you're a visitor here for the first time, thank you for choosing to be here with us. If you're a member or regular attendee, thank you for returning to join together with each other in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Whether you are here in the building or joining remotely, consider this time together a sanctuary for the soul, a sanctuary of peace and hope. It is a respite from the stress, acrimony, rancor, or hate that we too often encounter in the world. My name is Ted Zorn, and I'll be leading our service today and will later introduce our guest speaker. By the way, the whakatoki, or proverb, he waka eke noa, means a canoe, which we are all in with no exception, which seemed a good fit with our theme today. My opening words are by Betts Weinicke. As we gather together this morning, may we learn to recognize and affirm the pieces of possibility, the bits of good we bring. May we encourage rather than control, love rather than possess, enable rather than envy, allowing our individual gifts to weave a patchwork of peace, the soft, deep blue of sensitivity and understanding, the red energy of creativity, the white heat of convictions, the risky, fragile green of new growth, the golden flashes of gratitude, the warm rose of love. Each of us is indispensable if we are to minister to a broken and wounded world. Together, in our gathered diversity, we form the whole. So be it. The words that I will use for the chalice lighting this morning are by Douglas John Traversa. In a world filled with the darkness of ignorance, let us bring the light of reason. In a world filled with the darkness of despair, may we share the light of hope. In a world filled with the darkness of hate, let us shine the light of love. Wonky candle, sorry. We have a dim light, but a light nevertheless. I mean a very dim light. We'll see if it lasts. So, if you wish, please recite with me the covenant of our congregation. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is the sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow in harmony. Thus do we covenant with each other and with our God. For this morning's readings, I've chosen two quite different readings to fit with our theme. The first is by former U.S. President Barack Obama. It's an excerpt from a eulogy that he delivered in June 2015 at a memorial service for the Reverend Clementa Pinckney, one of 9 African Americans shot and killed in their church in Charleston, South Carolina, which happens to be the city of my birth and the city in which I was mostly raised, so it's quite personal to me. He was shot by a white supremacist. Obama's words: "For too long, we've been blind to the way past injustices continue to shape the present. Perhaps we see that now. Perhaps this tragedy causes us to ask some tough questions about how we can permit so many of our children to languish in poverty, or attend dilapidated schools, or grow up without prospects for a job or a career. Perhaps it causes us to examine what we're doing to cause some of our children to hate. Perhaps it softens hearts towards those young men, tens and thousands, caught up in the criminal justice system, and leads us to make sure that the system is not infected with bias, that we embrace changes in how we train and equip our police so that bonds of trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve make us all safer and more secure. Maybe we now realize the way racial bias can infect us, even when we don't realize it, so that we're guarding against not just racial slurs, but we're also guarding against the subtle impulse to call Johnny back for an interview, but not Jamal, so that we search our hearts when we consider laws to make it harder for some of our fellow citizens to vote. By recognizing our common humanity, by treating every child as important, regardless of the color of their skin or the station into which they were born, and to do what's necessary to make opportunity real for every American, by doing that, we express God's grace. The second reading is a poem by the late rapper Tupac Shakur called "And Tomorrow." Today is filled with anger. Today is filled with anger, fueled with hidden hate, scared of being outcast, afraid of common fate. Today is built on tragedies which no one wants to face, nightmares to humanities, and morally disgraced. Tonight is filled with rage, violence in the air, children bred with ruthlessness because no one at home cares. Tonight I lay my head down, but the pressure never stops, gnawing at my sanity, content when I am dropped. But tomorrow I see change, a chance to build anew, build on spirit, intent of heart, and ideals based on truth. And tomorrow I wake with second wind and strong because of pride, to know I fought with all my heart to keep my dream alive. I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today, who is distinguished Professor Emeritus Paul Spoonley. I've known Paul for many years, but I got to know him well when we worked together for several years on Massey University's senior leadership team. Paul is the head of the College of Arts and Sciences, and me as head of Massey Business School. And his common sense and sense of humor helped me through many of those meetings. Paul is one of New Zealand's finest sociologists, and he is an insightful observer of social changes in New Zealand. He's the author of, or editor of, many books, 27 at my last count, including fairly recently, The New New Zealand, Facing Demographic Disruption, and coming out very shortly, Histories of Hate, which he may mention today. Earlier this year, Paul was named co-director of the newly established National Center of Research Excellence for Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism, He Whenua Taurikura. The center was developed as a result of recommendations made by the Royal Commission of Inquiry following the 2019 mosque shootings in Christchurch. I have warned Paul that we refer to our talks as random musings, not as an expectation of what he's going to be saying to us. So Paul is going to be talking to us about the topic of today, the rise and rise of hate speech in an online world.
Kia ora tātou katoa, nā mihi nui. Nā mihi kia koe, Ted, thanks for the introduction. And te wharia tēnei, tēnā koe. I acknowledge the house in which we are sitting. Ted has kindly mentioned the book, The Histories of Hate, and so I've got a long have had a long connection in studying the far right. And so earlier this year, as Ted has indicated, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet appointed me as a co-director of Hei Whenua Tarikura. Hei Whenua land, Tarikura of peace, so a land of peace. And what we're tasked with doing is bringing together the best research and knowledge that we can to avoid ever having to encounter an event like the March 2019 again. So we are just getting underway. We had a hui here in Auckland 2 weeks ago, in which we brought together communities, government departments and experts, and we looked at the research that is available, but also the gaps that exist. Coincidentally, this book was written, Histories of Hate, was written before this appointment, but Paul Morris, who some of you might know, who's involved with religious diversity initiatives in New Zealand and is a member of the Jewish community, and I wrote the chapter on what's happening in countries like New Zealand at the moment. And so I just want to share some thoughts there of what we're seeing. What's interesting is that there's a moment, a tipping point around 2015-16, which is, I think, associated with Trump in various ways, although I want to be careful about drawing a straight line connection between what I'm going to be talking about and Trump. But what he did was mandate some forms of expression and speech. And what we've seen prior to that period in 2015-16 is the decline of the mass political parties around the world and the rise of various forms of tribalism. And in 2010, I was a senior Fulbright Fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, and in that year, the Tea Party were being established in the United States, and I took some interest in that. And we had a meeting at UC Berkeley that year, and many thought that with better education and better communication, the Tea Party's message of a America First, of a exclusionary nationalism, would be undermined. And there was an author who wrote a very good book, which appeared in 2016, called Ali Hochschild. And Ali said, well, no, you're misunderstanding what is happening. And there is a change beginning to occur in societies like the United States. And of course, the year in which her book came out, 2016, was the year in which we began to see this extrapolation, this growth in terms of hate online. I wrote the Cabinet paper on social cohesion in 2006. It wasn't accepted by Cabinet in this country, but one of the things that I talked about was the way in which we acknowledged diversity and the way in which we would incorporate and recognise diversity in various ways. And that involved not only those who are perhaps new to this country, like immigrants, but it involved communities that were here. I didn't understand the significance of what was happening online. And so you begin to see that enabling hate online, particularly in the last 5 to 7 years. And what I think the online world has done is make it possible to say things that are deeply hurtful, that are deeply vitriolic, and which target various individuals and communities. And I want to talk about anti-Semitism in a moment. But it was a possibility of doing one-to-many communication, that it was anonymous, and that it was a form of communication that had no accountability. And if you haven't seen the Graham Norton response to a question at a book event, in which he is charged with being on the side of wokeness, I can't remember the exact words, and he said, well, what we're really seeing is speech without accountability, and that, I think, is one of the challenges that we face. So we see this online world providing new political possibilities. But prior to that, there'd been some other things that have been happening. One of those was that identitarian movements had been growing, and there was a French author, Camus, who wrote a book in 2012 about what he called the Great Replacement, the idea that the white Christian West was being replaced, particularly by Islam and Muslims. From that you get phrases like white ethnocide or white genocide beginning to emerge. So that was one component of it. The other was the alternative right, which we now know as the alt-right, which began to be come into being really around the end of the first decade of the 21st century. Very much online, very much involving communities that had felt marginalised, and this is what Ali Hochschild talks about. She talks about the queue that is queuing for the great American dream, but gets very annoyed that women are given special consideration, or blacks, or Latinos, or the rainbow community, and is feeling further marginalised by the way in which these communities are being recognised and being given access to that great American dream, whereas others are not. And so the alt-right began to articulate some of these views in various ways. Now, we have the alt-right here in New Zealand. The Action Zealandia is a group that is here in Auckland and in other parts of New Zealand. You can look at their website, and their punchline is about preserving white New Zealand. And then, of course, in 2019, we had the Christchurch events, which really, I think, challenged many of us, because one of the things that I had experienced during my research and writing was that many New Zealanders felt that we were somehow exceptional. The events that we'd seen overseas, let's say the killing in Norway, was not something that would happen here. And so the events of Christchurch in 2019 really did challenge that. And since then, we've seen the escalation of online misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is material that is incorrect, but is circulated. Disinformation is deliberately misleading material. And that has grown, and I want to come back to the anti-Semitism here, because one of the things that I did when I first began to look at these groups in the 1980s in New Zealand was to look at anti-Semitism, and I've written about it and been a correspondent for various international organisations talking about the nature of anti-Semitism. But I've also been part of surveys of the Jewish community. Beginning in 1983, I've been involved in 4, and there's a 5th that occurred earlier this year. And one of the things about those surveys of the Jewish community was that the level of anti-Semitism they experienced in New Zealand was relatively low, much lower than, for example, in Australia, and certainly much lower than in Europe. But by the time that we completed the last one, which was just a couple of years ago, and then the one that was completed this year, in both cases, the level of anti-Semitism experienced by the Jewish community in New Zealand is now on par with other parts of the world. And so we've got this new wave of anti-Semitism that's been occurring. And if you go to particularly some of the American organisations like the Anti-Defamation League or the Southern Poverty Law Centre, you'll see there the year-on-year escalation. And so the European Union has a task force that's been looking at that, and they estimate that on a daily basis there are about 5 million politicised anti-Semitic tweets in the world. And so you can just see the level of it, and certainly that's true for New Zealand. Now, I think the moment in which some of these developments accelerated was COVID. COVID gave the far right and these groups that were anti-diversity, that were buying into some of these arguments about the Great Replacement and the identitarian movement in Europe, that COVID and what governments did in response to COVID was the moment in which both the anxiety of communities was increased, but also suspicion and trust in governments. Suspicion increased, trust dropped. And so, along with Sir Peter Gluckman and a few others, we looked at trust here in New Zealand in the early stages of COVID, and the trust in our health professionals, in our government, and in our institutions was incredibly high. And when we look at what happened around the world, then we could say that New Zealand was one of the few countries in which that trust was as high as it was. And Ted mentioned demography. One of the things that's really interesting is that COVID has reduced life expectancy in all OECD countries, 38 OECD countries, except for 3. And those 3 are Norway, Taiwan and New Zealand. And here in New Zealand, the response to COVID and what we did by way of public health measures actually saved about 3,500 people from dying in that period, particularly from things like influenza and pneumonia. But there's a very different stage that had emerged in the latter stages of our COVID management system, and you saw that in Parliament earlier this year. And the thing that was very concerning was the rise of conspiracy theories, particularly concerning the United Nations or other international bodies like the WHO. But it was also the Islamophobia, the anti-Semitism and the misogyny. And there's been some research which has just come out in the last few weeks in which misogyny, which is particularly directed at the Prime Minister, is a character of what's happened in New Zealand as part of these conspiratorial politics. But of all of the conspiratorial views, Chris Wilson, who's the researcher who's done this research, shows that the misogyny is the most toxic of those conspiratorial views. Now, going back to the anti-Semitism, what you then saw was the arguments, and it involved other groups, but you saw these arguments beginning to play out, that behind COVID, behind the government responses, behind international organisations, there was a cabal of Jews. And when you look at the QAnon arguments coming out of the United States, they very quickly descend into conspiratorial views, but particularly into anti-Semitism. So unfortunately, we've got to the point now where New Zealand is not exempt. It never was, but it's there's very good evidence that we are part of an international ecosystem in which this online hate is beginning to impact upon our community relations, but also on our politics. So there are going to be various tests of that. It looks as though in terms of local government, the attempt by some of these conspiratorial groups to undermine local government in New Zealand and the elections were not successful, but we're going to have a general election next year. It's going to be interesting to see what role these views play out in that. Can I just finish by talking about our responsibility and some of the impacts? I think the nature and impact of hate online is not understood by most of us. You might have seen Fire and Fury and 1 or 2 recent documentaries which try and explain that. But we should reach out to the communities that are targeted, the Muslim community, the Jewish community, the rainbow communities, and understand what it is they are experiencing. And as somebody who was involved with this prior to the events of 2019 in Christchurch, I was certainly very concerned, but my concern was particularly for younger New Zealanders. When we heard evidence from the communities, I was appalled at the level of hostility that some of these communities face, but the community that I think was most impacted were our teenagers. That what happens online is really problematic at the moment. So what are we going to do? Now, we've got hate speech legislation. The Minister has announced that it's coming before Parliament. You might have heard the news the last 48 hours that there will be an extension of the human rights provisions. So from nationality, race, ethnicity, it will now include religion, but unfortunately it does not include gender identity, which is puzzling, given the evidence I know the government have received. So one of the things that is going to be an issue is what do we do about hate online? And for me, legislation is important, but it's not as important as education. So, and something that Ted and I share, I think, is making sure that people have got digital literacy, that they know how to assess material online, how to understand it, and how to respond to it. And I've given Ted a pamphlet, which interestingly is being produced by the New Zealand Security Intelligence Service, which says what is it you should be looking for And then how do you respond to that? So one of our challenges is that in our communities, in our whānau and our peer groups, we're going to see people being radicalised by what they encounter online, and what is it that we should be looking for and what is it that we should do. That's really difficult. I mean, by the time it gets to Hei Whenua Tarekura, it is probably too late. But we need to do things in the community and in our more intimate settings. We certainly have an issue about what happens internationally. So a lot of what we encounter online does not originate in New Zealand. It might originate in QAnon in the United States or a troll factory in Russia. So we're at the end of a system of production, and it's very difficult to manage what happens in that system, because a lot of it is generated from overseas. What I'd love us to do is to say, well, if you're posting something online, we need to know who you are, and the platform should be treated as a publisher. So if they publish material which is hateful, then they are held responsible for that. I'm not holding my breath on either of those. I think the horse is probably bolted in terms of that. But the Christchurch call is beginning to have an impact, and some of the major platforms are beginning to respond to that. But that doesn't deal with what happens in the dark web. And so what happens in that dark web is still deeply problematic, and it's very difficult to control that. I think the final thing is that, going back to that paper on social cohesion, you might be aware that the Ministry of Social Development produced about 3 weeks ago a series of papers on social cohesion. I've got some issues with it, but at least it identifies some of the things that matter to community fabric. And for me, one of the things, as you've heard today, is that we really do need to understand the impact of what's happening online, and the possibility that it might be recruiting and radicalising people in a way that is deeply challenging and unsettling for social cohesion. And so if I can leave you with a plea, it is to perhaps, well, several pleas perhaps. One is to listen to those who are targeted. So if we're not personally targeted, it is often difficult to understand what people are experiencing. And at the moment, if you talk to members of the Muslim or Jewish community or the Rainbow community in New Zealand, you would be horrified, I think, by the sort of hate that they experience. The second is to take the conversation out into the public. I've been slightly appalled. Excuse me, Ted. I've been slightly appalled at the referencing of what happens in the United States as being a reference point for us here in New Zealand. We don't have a constitution. We don't have sheriffs. I don't know whether you've taken any notice of the sovereign citizens movement, but the rather bizarre idea that what happened with sheriffs in the United States in the 1870s is something that should apply here is rather bizarre. And when you look at the events of the parliamentary protest, why so many American flags? Why so many pro-Trump flags? Why so many pro-Trump slogans there? And then, of course, you bleed off into the very challenging conspiratorial views, which have largely come from a origin like QAnon. So let's be aware of these dynamics in our community, and let's try and work out how we respond to them, because they are deeply challenging. I don't have any of the answers. Hei Whenua Tarekura will provide some of those answers. The challenge is to get community leaders, religious leaders, politicians to take note of that, and then to do something about it, because at the end of the day, I think we're facing some enormously serious challenges in terms of the destructive of communities, powers of what happens online at the moment. So can I just leave you with that invitation, and thank you, Ted, for inviting me along today. And there will be a book next year. This is the advertisement. There will be a book next year which not only explains the history of these ideologies and politics in New Zealand, but also hopefully some insight into what's happening at the moment. Kia ora tātou.
Thank you very much, Paul. I should have mentioned that Paul's wife, Dr. Jennifer Crowley, has joined him here today. They have 2 new grandchildren, and so they have an important commitment. So I've said it's perfectly okay for them to leave after Paul's talk. So great to have you both here. The booklet that Paul mentioned, Know the Signs, A Guide to Identifying Signs of Violent Extremism. There are about 6 copies in the back. Here's a 7th. And if there are others who want them, please let me know, and I'll see if I can get Paul to provide some more to us. Please join with me as we say the words for extinguishing the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. My closing words are an excerpt from a sermon by Martin Luther King in 1957. The sermon was entitled, "Loving Your Enemies." Now, for the few moments left, let us move from the practical how to the theoretical why. It's not only necessary to know how to go about loving your enemies, but also to go down into the question of why we should love our enemies. I think the first reason that we should love our enemies, and I think this was at the very center of Jesus' thinking, is this: that hate for hate only intensifies the existence of hate and evil in the universe. If I hit you and you hit me, and I hit you back and you hit me back and go on, you see that goes on ad infinitum. It just never ends. Somewhere, somebody must have a little sense. And that's the strong person. The strong person is the person who can cut off the chain of hate, the chain of evil. And that is the tragedy of hate, that it doesn't cut it off. It only intensifies the existence of hate and evil in the universe. Somebody must have religion enough and morality enough to cut it off and inject within the very structure of the universe that strong and powerful element of love. So here are a couple of questions to get the discussion started. What do you do when you encounter what you believe is hate speech? So what do you do when you encounter what you believe is hate speech? And secondly, what can we do about hate speech, both individually and collectively? So what do you do when you encounter it? What can we do, individually and collectively?